Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be talking about American capital and labor during the Gilded Age.
Ooh,
We've got some great excerpts for you today from Capital and Labor in the American Yawp.
that's right.
And, it's a really interesting look at how the U.S. economy just completely transformed
Yeah,
and all the craziness, all the social and political upheavals that came about because of it.
totally. I mean, it's
So are you ready to kind of uncover how all of this rapid industrialization
mhm.
created crazy wealth for
Yeah.
some and just intense poverty for many?
Oh yeah, it's a period of just incredible dynamism, but also like brutal conflict.
Yeah, definitely brutal. So to kick things off, why don't we start with a moment that really captures that whole conflict?
Sorry.
The Great Railroad Strike of 1877.
Oh yeah.
The railroads were like the backbone of the American economy at this point, right?
Oh totally.
So when these workers went on strike after a bunch of wage cuts,
Mhm.
it just sent shockwaves across the whole nation.
It's important to remember the context here.
Yeah.
The railroad bubble had just burst in 1873,
Oh, right.
and that led to, kind of like economic stagnation.
Oh, wow.
But the crazy thing is, these companies were still getting government subsidies, and they were paying dividends to their shareholders.
So the workers were really bearing the brunt of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they essentially said, enough is enough.
Yeah, basically.
These strikes, though, they weren't just like isolated incidents, right?
Oh no, they spread everywhere like wildfire.
Wow.
From Baltimore to Pittsburgh to St. Louis,
Wow.
workers just shut down rail traffic across the nation.
So basically brought the country's economic engine to a grinding halt.
Pretty much.
And what was the reaction from the government and businesses?
Well, it was swift and brutal, to say the least.
Like a real show of force.
Oh yeah, local police state militias,
Wow.
even federal troops were deployed to put down these strikes.
Oh my gosh.
And the violence was really widespread.
Yeah, I bet.
For example, like in Baltimore, the militia fired into a crowd of striking workers.
Oh no.
Yeah, 11 people were killed and many others were injured.
Oh, that's awful.
It was a really dark time.
Yeah, there's that one quote from the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad
Oh yeah.
suggesting giving workers a rifle diet to like teach them a lesson.
Uh-huh.
Really highlights just the animosity towards the labor movement at the
Oh,
right.
for sure.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about like breaking up these strikes.
Yeah.
It was about sending a message.
Mm-hmm.
Capital held the power and they would do whatever it took to keep it.
Wow. So this great upheaval, as it's called, resulted in almost 100 deaths
Yeah, that's crazy.
and millions of dollars in property damage.
Oh.
And, it really kind of set the stage for like decades of labor conflict in the U.S.
For sure.
What's interesting is that both sides kind of became even more dug in
Oh, yeah, totally.
in their positions after this.
Yeah, the strike's failure, I think it showed workers that they needed,
Mm-hmm.
stronger organizations,
Right.
which led to the growth of unions.
Okay.
And at the same time, capital just doubled down on consolidating their power
Wow.
and, getting their hands in politics.
So then we see this whole clash between capital and labor happening,
Mm.
while there's also incredible technological advancement and economic growth.
Yeah.
Seems a little paradoxical.
It's a period of contradictions for sure.
Yeah.
You have all these like unbelievable innovations happening,
Mm.
like McCormick's Reaper,
Yeah.
Singer's sewing machine,
Mm-hmm.
Ford's assembly line.
Ah.
I mean, it's transforming industries and creating these massive corporations.
Yeah, but it seems like this progress came at a pretty steep price
Oh, definitely.
for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, like, what was the human cost of all of this?
Well, take the rise of scientific management
Okay.
or Taylorism.
Right.
It revolutionized production,
Mm-hmm.
but it also made workers feel like they were just cogs in a machine,
Wow.
easily replaceable and dehumanized.
Yeah. And you see
Yeah.
the same pattern with the rise of monopolies.
Oh, for sure.
So, like, cutthroat competition turns into mergers and consolidation,
Hmm.
and you end up with these giant corporations like General Electric and
Right.
DuPont
Yeah.
controlling entire industries.
And of course, you have the formation of U.S. Steel,
Oh, yeah.
orchestrated by the financial titan,
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan.
J.T. Morgan.
So this concentration of power,
Yeah.
I mean, it created crazy amounts of wealth for a very select few.
But it also created just like a chasm of inequality
I know.
between the rich and the poor.
While these robber barons were amassing unimaginable fortunes,
Hmm.
millions of laborers were toiling in dangerous conditions
Yeah.
for just meager wages.
And the gap just kept getting wider.
Oh, yeah, it did.
And then there's this emergence of social Darwinism,
Oh, right.
This idea that
Yeah.
the wealthiest were just like naturally the fittest,
A fittest, yeah.
while the poor were somehow just like less deserving.
Right. Like it was their own fault.
Yeah.
It's pretty messed up when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
Um, Writers like H.L. Mencken and William Graham Sumner,
Okay.
they really pushed this view and used it to justify all the inequality of the Gilded Age.
So basically, they used ideology to legitimize injustice.
Pretty much.
Wow. And all of this happened while the Republican Party was just dominating the political scene.
Oh, yeah. For most of this period,
Okay.
the Republicans, with their, pro-business stance and policies like high protective tariffs,
Right.
definitely tipped the scales in favor of capital,
Hmm.
which made things really hard for the labor movement.
Yeah, so how did these workers fight back?
That is the question.
Yeah.
Given everything stacked against them,
Yeah.
how did they try to get a fair share of the prosperity that they were helping to create?
They were the ones building it.
Exactly.
So can you imagine like just the daily grind
Oh, yeah.
that these industrial workers face?
Yeah.
Long hours, low wages, unsafe conditions, and like the constant fear of losing your job?
And it wasn't just like, a few people. This was the norm for most industrial workers.
Yeah, what were the numbers like?
Well, the typical worker was putting in like 60 hours a week.
Oh my gosh.
60 hours.
Wow.
And often for an annual income that was actually below the poverty line.
So they weren't even making enough to survive.
Pretty much. And a lot of families had to send their wives and children to work just to make ends meet.
Wow. That's just heartbreaking.
It was a really tough time.
So how did organized labor even like come out of all this?
Well, I think the failure of the 1877 strike
Okay.
was really a turning point.
How so?
Well, it showed workers that they had power in collective action.
Yeah.
But it also showed them that they needed stronger and more organized unions.
So like what were some of the major unions that came about?
Well, one of the most notable ones was the Knights of Labor.
Okay, the Knights of Labor.
Yeah, they had this really ambitious vision
Oh, yeah.
of a cooperative commonwealth.
What does that even mean?
Well, basically, it's where workers have more control and influence
Okay.
over the economy.
So they were pretty radical.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And what's interesting about the Knights is that they wanted to unite both skilled and unskilled workers.
Okay, so like everybody.
Everybody, yeah. They understood that everyone who labored deserved a fair share of the wealth they helped create.
That's a pretty powerful message.
It was. But they faced some serious challenges.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, a lot of businesses and the government saw them as a threat,
I can imagine.
and they often used pretty brutal tactics to suppress them.
Oh, like what kind of tactics?
Well, like in the Great Southwest Railroad strike of 1886,
Okay.
the Knights were up against the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
Who are they?
Basically, they were like a private army.
What?
Yeah, corporations would hire them to break up strikes.
Wow, so it was like a private militia?
Pretty much.
Oh my gosh. So they were going up against like armed guards?
Yeah, basically. And then there was the Haymarket Riot.
Right, Haymarket.
That one really hurt the labor movement.
I've heard of that, but I don't really know the details.
Well, basically, there was this big labor demonstration in Chicago,
Okay.
and somebody threw a bomb at the police,
Oh, wow.
and it caused this huge riot.
So what happened?
Well, several people were killed and injured,
Oh my gosh.
and even though there wasn't really any evidence linking the bombing to the Knights of Labor, they got blamed for it.
Oh, wow. So they were like scapegoated.
Exactly. The media and the government used the incident to paint them as dangerous radicals.
And that just like destroyed their reputation.
Pretty much. Yeah, it led to their decline.
Wow. So it sounds like fear and public perception can be really powerful weapons.
Oh, absolutely. They can make or break a movement.
Yeah, for sure. So then how did the American Federation of Labor come out of all of this?
Well, the AFL was kind of a different approach.
Okay. In what way?
Well, they were led by Samuel Gompers,
Okay.
and they focused on skilled workers.
So not every...
Right. And they practiced what they called pure and simple trade unionism.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Basically, it meant they prioritized negotiations over confrontation.
So they were trying to work within the system.
Yeah, exactly. They aimed for things like better wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions.
So like basic rights.
Exactly. But even those basic rights were hard to come by.
I bet.
I mean, the Homestead Strike in 1892 and the Pullman Strike in 1894.
Yeah.
Those are just two examples of the brutal clashes that kept happening.
Yeah, those are really violent.
Yeah, they were. And the government and the corporations were still using Pinkertons,
Wow.
state militias, even federal troops to crush these strikes.
So they were still using a lot of force.
Oh, yeah. And they were also using court injunctions to prevent unions from organizing.
It's crazy how the system was just so stacked against the workers.
It really was. And we're not even talking about isolated incidents here.
Right.
There were over 20,000 strikes and lockouts
20,000.
in the late 19th century.
Wow, that's a lot.
It just shows how desperate workers were for change.
Yeah, and it wasn't just industrial workers who were struggling.
That's right.
Farmers were also dealing with a lot of challenges.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution had this ripple effect across the whole society. And for farmers, it often meant falling crop prices, rising debt, and this growing dependence on a really unpredictable national economy.
So they basically felt like they were losing control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were at the mercy of these market forces they couldn't really understand.
So what did they do?
Well, they started organizing too.
Okay.
And one of the most important groups to emerge was the Farmers Alliance.
Okay, the Farmers Alliance.
Yeah, they were all about cooperation and sharing resources.
Interesting.
And they even envisioned this kind of cooperative commonwealth.
Oh, wow, so like the Knights of Labor?
Yeah, exactly. They wanted a system that put people's needs before profits.
So we're seeing this shared frustration with the system,
Yeah.
uniting farmers and laborers.
And that frustration is what eventually led to populism. Yeah, the rise of the People's Party or the populists. It's a really fascinating chapter in American history.
So tell me about them.
Well, they brought together all these different groups.
Like who?
Farmers, laborers, reformers.
Okay.
People who felt like both the Democrats and the Republicans had abandoned them.
So they were like a third party.
Yeah, exactly. And
That
they were
makes-
a true grassroots movement.
And they had this really progressive platform, right?
Oh, yeah, the Omaha Platform.
Yeah, what was in it?
Well, they called for things like nationalizing the railroads and telegraphs,
Wow.
a graduated income tax, the direct election of senators.
So they wanted to give more power to the people?
Exactly. And a lot of their ideas were considered really radical at the time.
Yeah, but some of them actually ended up becoming law later on.
That's right. They were ahead of their time.
Yeah, and their message really resonated with people.
It did. I mean, you had people like Mary Elizabeth Lease.
Oh, yeah. What did she say?
She told farmers to raise less corn and more hell.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement.
She was an amazing speaker.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
She really knew how to tap into the anger and frustration of people who felt like they were being left behind.
So did they have any success?
Well, they did pretty well in the elections of 1892 and 1894,
Okay.
especially after the Panic of 1893.
What was that?
It was a major economic depression,
Oh.
and it really exposed how fragile the financial system was.
So people were looking for alternatives.
Exactly. And the populists offered a real alternative.
But they also faced some obstacles, right?
Oh, yeah, especially in the South.
What happened in the South?
Well, the Southern Democrats were really determined to hold on to their power.
Okay.
And they used all sorts of dirty tricks to suppress the populist vote.
Like what kind of tricks?
Well, everything from voter intimidation to outright fraud.
Wow. So they're basically cheating.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's a sad example of how powerful interests can resist change.
Even when it's really needed.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And it's important to acknowledge that the populists themselves
Yeah.
weren't always perfect.
How so?
Well, they sometimes struggled with racial prejudice, especially in the South.
Yeah, that's a problem.
It reminds us that even movements that are fighting for justice can still be flawed.
Yeah, nobody's perfect.
Exactly. And progress isn't always straightforward.
Right.
It can be messy and complicated.
So despite all these challenges, a new leader emerged.
That's right, William Jennings Bryan.
William Jennings Bryan.
Yeah, he was a rising star in the Democratic Party,
Okay.
and he became like the voice of populism.
What made him so special?
Well, he was a gifted orator,
Okay.
and he really championed the cause of farmers and laborers.
So he was like a man of the people.
Exactly. And he had this really powerful message about social justice.
And his big issue was free silver, right?
That's right. He believed that bimetallism, which is the free coinage of silver alongside gold, would help to inflate the currency.
And why was that important?
Well, he thought it would help farmers pay off their debts.
Okay, so it was like an economic policy,
Exactly. And it was a direct challenge to the gold standard.
which was supported by the Republicans and the wealthy elite.
Right. They wanted to keep the currency tied to gold.
So the 1896 election was basically a battle over the future of the American economy?
It was. And Bryan gave this incredibly famous speech at the Democratic National Convention.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of this, the Cross of Gold speech.
That's the one. It was really powerful.
What did he say?
Well, he basically argued that the gold standard was crucifying the working class.
Wow. That's a pretty strong image.
Yeah, it was. And it really resonated with people who were struggling.
So did he win?
He didn't. He lost to William McKinley.
Oh, so the Republicans won.
Yeah, and it was a big setback for the populist movement.
But even though he lost his campaign, still had a big impact, right?
Oh, for sure. He helped to shift the national conversation.
Mm.
And he forced the major parties to start paying attention
Okay.
to issues like economic inequality and the plight of farmers and laborers.
So he kind of paved the way for future reforms.
Exactly. And then the populists had this tough choice to make after the election.
What was that?
Well, the Democrats had basically adopted a lot of their ideas.
Okay.
So they had to decide whether to stay independent
Right.
or join forces with the Democrats.
That's a tough one.
It was, and it ended up dividing the movement.
So what happened?
Well, some populists joined the Democrats,
Okay.
while others stayed independent.
And what about the People's Party?
Well, it eventually faded away.
But their ideas didn't disappear.
No, they didn't. They helped to inspire the progressive era,
Okay.
and a lot of their reforms eventually became reality.
So their legacy lived on.
It did,
Yeah.
and it shows how powerful grassroots movements can be.
Yeah, they can really shake things up.
They can, even if they don't win right away.
Right. So the fight for economic justice continued.
It did, and another important movement was emerging alongside populism,
What was that?
socialism.
So these socialists, they were really talking about like a whole different kind of system.
Oh, yeah. They took that cooperative commonwealth idea
Yeah.
even further.
Mm.
I mean, they were talking about a world where the workers actually own the means of production.
Wow, that's pretty radical.
It was, and it was inspired by Karl Marx, and fueled by all this discontent among the industrial workers.
So who were some of the big names in the socialist movement?
Well, you had folks like Eugene Debs
Okay.
and Oscar Mehringer.
Right.
They were really powerful critics of capitalism.
Yeah.
They argued that it just naturally creates inequality and exploits people.
And their message, it wasn't just for like the working class?
No, not at all. It resonated with people from all different backgrounds.
Heck,
Well, you had intellectuals like Helen Keller,
wow.
authors like Upton Sinclair and Jack London,
Mm.
and of course tons of laborers, miners, and farmers.
So it was like a diverse coalition.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
I mean, it seems like a lot of Americans just felt like capitalism wasn't working for them.
They did. And the socialist movement, it offered a real alternative, like a vision of a world where everyone could actually thrive.
Not just the wealthy few.
Exactly.
And there was this group called the Industrial Workers of the World.
Right, the IWW.
Or the Wobblies.
Yeah, the Wobblies, they really embodied that whole idea of inclusivity.
So they were open to everyone.
Yeah, regardless of race, gender, or skill level.
And they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty.
Oh, no, they weren't. They were big believers in direct action.
So like, what kind of things did they do?
They organized strikes, boycotts, demonstrations, anything to challenge corporate power.
And they faced a lot of pushback, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, they did, both from businesses and the government.
So they were kind of like on the front lines.
They were, and the Socialist Party of America, they were also making some gains.
Really?
Yeah, in the political arena.
Like what kind of gains?
Well, they had elected mayors in cities across the country.
Wow.
And they even had 2 representatives in Congress.
No way.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
It is. So for a while, it seemed like they were really gaining momentum.
They were, for sure.
But then World War I happened.
Yeah, and that changed everything.
How so?
Well, the war just created this climate of intense nationalism and fear of anything that seemed un-American.
And socialism was an easy target.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was already seen as radical,
right?
But now it was like treasonous.
Wow.
The government cracked down on dissent,
Mm.
and the socialist movement lost a lot of its steam.
It's crazy how quickly things can change.
It's 1 minute you're on the rise,
Yeah.
and the next minute you're being silenced.
So even though the socialist movement declined, they still had a lasting impact.
Oh, definitely.
In what way?
Well, they forced Americans to really think about economic inequality
Mm.
and the role of government in regulating the economy.
So they helped to shape the debate.
They did,
Yeah.
and some of their ideas that were once considered radical,
Yeah.
they eventually became mainstream.
So like the populists, their legacy lived on.
It did, and it's fascinating to see how these Gilded Age battles between capital and labor, they're still relevant today.
In what way?
Well, I mean, we're still dealing with income inequality,
Oh, yeah.
worker rights, corporate greed.
It's like history is repeating itself.
In some ways it is.
So what do you think, would the world be different
Hmm.
if some of these more radical visions for a just society
Yeah.
had actually taken hold back then?
It's hard to say, but it's a question worth thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
It reminds us that history is not just something that happened in the past.
Hmm.
It still shapes our lives today.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Gilded Age,
Yeah.
it's amazing to think about all the people who fought for a better world.
Hmm.
They may not have won every battle, but they paved the way for progress.
Absolutely.
And their stories, they can still inspire us.
They can. And if you're interested in learning more about this period,
Yeah.
I highly recommend checking out the American Yawp.
It's a great resource.
It is.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic.
See you next time.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.